Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Ben Rybeck, and I am the general manager of House of Books here in Kent, Connecticut. Welcome to the bookstore. And it is my great pleasure this evening to welcome you all here to a wonderful conversation moderated by Rory Stewart between Adrian Wooldridge and John Micklethwait, co-authors of The Wake Up Call, brand new from HarperCollins via. A couple things that I want to say, first of all, to thank people without whom an event like this could not be possible. I want to thank our tech guru, Amanda Myers, who is running this event behind the scenes and making sure everything goes smoothly. If you have any sort of a tech issue at any point, just put it in the chat and she will reach out to you to resolve it. I also, of course, want to thank two dear friends of ours here at House of Books, Ben Rosen and Donna Rosen, for singing the praises of this book to begin with, for singing the praises of John and Adrian and Rory, and for essentially putting this event together. So to them, my gratitude for this event and for everything else they do to support this bookstore and this community. House of Books has been independently owned and operated since the mid-70s. We feature an eclectic mix of literary fiction, general interest nonfiction, poetry, art books, cookbooks, kids books, all sorts of stuff. And we always want you to take a look at our website, houseofbooksct.com. You can browse our shelves there by the sections that are in the store. You can place any orders. We ship books. You can do curbside pickup if you're in the area. You can also sign up for our newsletter to find out about all of our other upcoming events. And we do have a lot more coming up, so please, once again, houseofbooksct.com, and hopefully we'll see you again sometime. As for tonight's event, it's really a pleasure to get this group of people together. So serving as this evening's extraordinarily distinguished moderator, we have Rory Stewart. He's a British author, explorer, diplomat, academic, and politician. And since August of 2020, he has been a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, where he teaches politics and international relations. And of course, as I mentioned, he's also an author, most recently of The Marches. So Rory, thank you so very much for being here with us this evening.
Thank you.
And as for the co-authors, I'll introduce them sort of together and we'll bring them on together. John Micklethwait is the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg, where he oversees editorial content across all Bloomberg platforms, including its news, newsletters, magazines, opinion, television, radio, and digital properties, as well as its research services, including Bloomberg Intelligence. Adrian Wooldridge is the management editor and columnist at The Economist. He was educated at Balliol College, Oxford, and All Souls College, Oxford, where he held a prize fellowship. He was formerly The Economist's Washington bureau chief and Lexington columnist. The two of them are the co-author of several other books, but most recently, this book right here, The Wake Up Call. So please join me in welcoming John Micklethwait and Adrian Wooldridge.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming and dialing in. And I think we owe a huge thank you to John and Adrian, who you may not be aware are actually speaking to us from the United Kingdom. So it's past midnight with them, and it's a real tribute to them that they're joining us. And we're all sorry not to be together in Ben's wonderful shop. But if I could start, this is the latest in a series of very remarkable books which John and Adrian have written together, very unusual partnership. Two of certainly the brightest, but also some of the most effective journalists in Britain who've turned their eyes to many different things. But they have now produced this extraordinary book, which I hope many of you have already bought. If you haven't, please buy it, called The Wake Up Call. And I'm going to start by asking John, why is it that he thinks we need to wake up?
Rory, thank you I will also very quickly, just as I begin, thank Donna and Ben Rosen particularly, as well as Ben from the House of Books, where I've been, and it's a very fantastic bookshop, and the American Friends of the British Museum, yet another organisation which I nominally head, but other people really run. Why do we think we wanted to write this book? I think there were two reasons. About when COVID began, it became sort of clear to us that two things were happening. The first was that suddenly government mattered. To be very basic about it, good government was the difference between living and dying. And when we look around the world, you began to see a sort of scorecard of sorts. To give you the rough numbers, America is closing in on 600 deaths for every million people. Britain is sadly above that number. You go down to Germany, and that is at 100 deaths per million people. So i.e. roughly 6 times better. Canada's around 250. But you go really further than that, you go out to Asia, and you begin to find quite remarkable numbers. Korea's around 50. Most of the other ones, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, Vietnam, even countries like that are around 30 or 40 deaths per million people. And so what this said to us in some ways was, look, our governments are not as good at protecting us as we thought they were. And if you go around the rest of Asia, you come to the second reason for writing the book. And that was that if you look at China's number, China claims a number of 3 deaths per million people. Now, we, like many other people, would assume that that number is probably not entirely true. But imagine, just for the sake of argument, that they are fibbing and they're hiding 9 out of 10 deaths. That would still give China a ratio of 30 deaths per million. Remember, America is close to 600. So under that definition, the Chinese regime is roughly 20 times better than Washington at preserving its people. And the reason why we thought that was important is because in the great swing of history, and there's a lot of history in our book, you go all the way back to 1600 or 1650 when Thomas Hobbes was writing Leviathan, probably the first big book about government. Back then, China was absolutely in charge of the world. A quarter of the world's GDP. It was by far the world's most impressive country. We pushed back against that. The West overtook Asia, overtook China. And what strikes us is, I know there's a lot of fuss, and I spend a lot of time in my day job covering it. You look at the American election, yes, that matters. You look at the search for the vaccine, yes, that matters. But in the end, if this is the year when Asia began to go past the West, that is what historians, the future Rory Stewart's, will remember. There's one final reason for looking at it, is it struck us that this was the moment to tell the West that if the West does not unite, then it will get nowhere. And there have been few bigger disasters for the West than this, where the West has not come together. So for all those reasons, we say to the West, wake up. It does not necessarily mean that we're heading towards a Sino-centric century, but certainly the evidence of the numbers is compelling that Asia generally has done so much better, and we have done worse, and we should learn from them. And that was the point. That was the reason to say wake up.
So maybe this is something to say to Adrian, but it's easy sitting in the United States to imagine that some of the reasons why the United States found it difficult to respond is to do both with the particular personality of the president, or maybe to do with the constitutional system in the US and the relationship between the federal government and state governments. It's a big, unwieldy country. But why has Britain performed even worse? It's a relatively small island. It's a centralized state. It's meant to have a very effective civil service. It's got a big national health service, so it hasn't got any of those challenges that the US faces. Nevertheless, Britain is performing worse than the United States. Why do you think that is, Adrian?
Well, it is extraordinary how badly Britain has performed. Not quite as badly as America, but certainly much worse than most other European countries. And I would say that
Adrian, at many points, in terms of not in overall deaths, but in deaths per million, the United Kingdom has performed worse than the United States. Yeah,
that's true. That's true. It's much patchier in the United States, I think, because it's a much bigger and more dispersed country. But that definitely is true. I would say what's happened in Britain is a result of a very slow response to the virus. We were very slow to see what was going on. We were very slow to purchase PPE on the global market, tests on the global market. We were very slow to lock down. If we locked down, I think, a couple of weeks earlier than we did, we would probably have had half the number of deaths that we had. It was a very sluggish response from the government. I think some of it was to do with the Prime Minister. I think he didn't go to the first 5 COBRA meetings dealing with COVID, but it was also a more general sluggishness on the part of the administrative class and the government. And I remember listening to you, Rory, talking about this on the Today programme, along with Neil Ferguson, the epidemiologist. You were one of the first people in the political world to talk about this. And later that day, I happened to come across a junior health minister at the Beefsteak Club at lunch. And so I was asking him about this epidemic, which was clearly on its way from China, and asking him about Neil Ferguson's estimate, how rapidly he would spell. He'd never heard of Neil Ferguson, which I thought was quite stunning. And then I asked him what he was doing, what they were doing to prepare for this. And they said, no, we're really focused on parking fees. It's the parking in our hospital car parks that we're spending all our time looking at. So it was, I mean, Boris was in charge, so he should have sent a signal throughout the system, but the system was very slow to adjust. And I would say this is partly the result of populism, that we just had this populist revolt against the establishment, against the established way of doing things. And you had a government that had come to power suspicious of experts, but also committed to Brexit. And Brexit really dominated everything, dominated their thinking. It took a long time to shift attention from Brexit to the rest of the world. So I also just finished. I just want to say the other thing is extraordinary insularity, that we saw this thing coming. We saw this thing spreading through Asia. We saw Asian countries responding quite well to it, and the way that they responded indicated there are certain things you needed to do, such as wearing masks, such as locking down, such as isolating people who got it. And we just didn't look at what was going on. There was no discussion of that model, of that approach. And finally, we have in Britain at the moment the weakest cabinet. I think that's certainly in my lifetime. We have very good people like Jeremy Hunt, who are simply excluded from the cabinet. So you have a prime minister not engaged, a cabinet of pygmies, and an administrative system very lethargic in its response to things. Sorry, I stopped you.
And John, just to come back to this, is there something inherent in the nature of populism which means that populist leaders don't respond very nimbly to crises? Is it that the type of politics they do, the way they're used to campaigning, makes crisis management something that doesn't come as naturally to them as different types of politics?
Yes, I think that's a very good point. I mean, I would make 2 things, one which totally backs that, and that is that simply, populists really about causing crises rather than managing them. And if you look at, I mean, we talked about Trump and we talked about Johnson, they're good at causing a fuss, they're good at provoking people. The people who've done really well in this crisis tend to be people like Ahern from New Zealand, or particularly Angela Merkel from Germany. You sit there, you manage the thing, you organize things, you run it efficiently. There's an irony, we think, in the fact that conservatives generally have sold themselves to the world. You may even have done this once or twice yourself, as being the people who were good at efficiency and competence and all those things. But because both the Conservative Party and the Republicans are in the hands of populists, that did not happen. I would, however, I mean, I think in this book, we are extremely critical of Donald Trump in terms of the way that he handled the virus, his sluggishness at coming in, it much worse than Johnson in some ways. I mean, Johnson reacted speedily compared with Trump, given the amount of warning Trump had. And his failure to unite the West, I think, will be something of huge kind of long-term geopolitical consequence. However, I think it's really important, if anyone on this call thinks that by electing Joe Biden, you're going to change many of the things that didn't work, I think that's just wrong. One basic reason for this is America has a healthcare system that is designed to look after the rich and the old and not the poor. And that was brutally exposed this time. In the same way as if you're worried about racist policing in America. Yes, you can blame Donald Trump for some of the things, but I covered Rodney King 30 years ago. Donald Trump is not responsible for racist policing. You look at bad schools. America has been behind these places in Asia in terms of schools long before Donald Trump came over. So if you think that by getting rid of Donald Trump, it's going to make any difference to the fact that America's government has fallen so far behind these new emerging countries and parts of and other countries too, then getting rid of Donald Trump is not the answer. It may be a good thing, but it's not the answer.
One of the things that seems to come again and again in your book is a real fascination with Singapore. And I wonder whether Adrian perhaps could tell us a little bit about why he thinks Singapore is an interesting model, an admirable model, something we can learn from.
Interesting and admirable are slightly different things. I think it's interesting in that it takes many of the tenets of the Western model and really challenges them in a fundamental way. It takes the notion of democracy and replaces it with political meritocracy. It takes the notion of a generous welfare state and an all-you-can-eat welfare state, in Lee Kuan Yew's phrase, and it replaces it with a much more stingy insurance-based system. It takes the notion of big, ever-expanding government and replaces it with a vision of much smaller government in terms of spending it as a proportion of GDP. And it takes the notion of freedom, of individual rights, individual freedom, and it challenges that with a much more communitarian authoritarian view of things. Now, I think some of those things are interesting, some of them are objectionable, but all of them come together to make a very powerful, I think the most powerful challenge to the Western liberal democratic order that we've seen. We've seen many challenges to the liberal democratic order that have not worked, but this is a challenge that is working. I think the standard of living in Singapore is probably higher than it is in Britain. The life expectancy is higher, the educational results are far superior to that. So it's what really worries me is that China is going to model itself on Singapore and become a sort of giant Singapore. There are all sorts of terrible things about China. There's kleptocracy, there's autocracy, there's dictatorship, but those are sort of things that we're familiar with, and we know that they ultimately fail. But what happens if they copy a model that is successful? And that's why I think Singapore is so fascinating. I also, by the way, think there's lots of things we can learn from Singapore and incorporate into a more democratic tradition. But it's an extraordinary development.
Let's give a little bit on that. John, give us a sense of some of the things that you think we might learn from better run states. What are practical things that could be done in the United States which would improve the quality of our government?
We'll just keep on Singapore for a second, because it's an interesting point on this. Yes, Singapore has all these sort of weird authoritarian things like not being able to chew gum and the somewhat strange sayings of Lee Kuan Yew, although he was, as we know, it's amazing how influential he is in China. But that said, the basic reason why the Singaporean state works is really simple, is it does everything possible to bring the elite of Singapore into the state to make them work for it. It pays people at the top a lot. It pays, if you run the Singaporean civil service, you get over $1 million a year. If you want a comparison, the Bureau of Veteran Affairs, I think it's the same size as the Singaporean service, I think probably a little bit bigger. The guy there, I don't think it's still a man, gets paid about $200,000 a year, or maybe it's 100 and something. The Republicans would never ever dream of letting public servants in the West get paid that sort of money, or in America get paid that sort of money. But on the other side of it is, if you're no good in the Singaporean public service, you're out. So if you're a bad teacher in Singapore, you're out almost immediately. And that is something that the Democrats would never dream of doing because of their connections to the public sector unions in America. And so I think what's interesting about Singapore is people look at it and they focus on things like the authoritarian thing. Most of the Asian countries are much cleverer. They just avoid all that and they go straight to the basic idea, which is try and bring competent people in to run your civil service, something that we haven't, and I say we, I mean really the West and particularly America hasn't done in a big way since, we would argue, since the 1960s. But at the same time, you you make it elitist, you make sure that there are good people. And the interesting thing about Singapore is its state is a tiny fraction of the size of what America has in terms of the percentage of GDP. But you look at the schools and the hospitals, and they're the best in the world. And what's interesting to me is you look at places like South Korea. I mean, okay, you couldn't say Singapore is small and insular. You look at South Korea, and it's very interesting. You compare three cities, compare Seoul, New York, and London. Now, they're all about the same size. Seoul, in fact, is slightly bigger than London and New York. And now look at the number of people who died. In New York, it's over 20,000 people. In London, it's 6,000 people. In one stretch, more people were killed in one 4-week stretch than were killed in the worst 4 weeks of the Blitz. Look at Seoul now. Seoul is, I think, 6 or 4 dozen, depending how you measure it. It's tiny. And the immediate answer is to say, oh, that's just because Asians are different. Rubbish. Just, think of Seoul. It's got some of the biggest nightclubs in the world. It's the home of K-pop, all this music. It created Parasite, which won the Oscar. It has teeming subways. It has streets. In many ways, it's just another big, large city. But they did things like they organized testing. They've done all the basic, got people to wear masks in the right places. They did all the things that New York and London failed to do. And I think if people in the West get away with the excuse that it's all to do with something to do with culture, they are running away from the real reason, which is simply that the Asians are putting more effort into government than we are, and it's paying back.
I mean, it's something that I see directly. I mean, here in Yale, they are testing 2,200 students a day, and we've been doing that now since we came back 5 weeks ago. We've so far, I think, had 7 cases, and it's a real model. It's extraordinary. It's an example of the United States, admittedly an elite institution, doing something very, very well. You can get a test in about 90 seconds rolling out of your car, and the whole university is going, and I'm still teaching in person. So you're absolutely right, it can be done. It's just staggering that our governments seem to be so bad at doing it at a large scale. Can I, finally, before I go to questions, because I'd love to bring some other people, and there's some very distinguished people on the call, but I suppose the question for me as a working politician is whether you can actually practically, politically sell this type of vision. It's lovely for me reading this to learn that a junior minister in Singapore earns $1 million a year. And indeed, as somebody who was a minister in the British government, I would have loved to earn $1 million a year. But the notion that I would ever have been able to tell my constituents that the solution to their ills was to pay their politicians more, it seemed a bit unrealistic. I mean, I suspect my politicians would have said, my constituents said, what the hell do you need with $1 million a year? What kind of lifestyle are you trying to live? Why are you doing this, right? And the same applies basically to quite a lot of this analysis, which is that it's an unashamedly elite analysis. The Singaporean model was based on the British colonial system. And the British colonial system essentially took people with enormous brains like Adrian and then put them to run things, right?
But you don't want Adrian running any city.
but actually our societies are much more concerned with not with trying to create an elite of that sort. We're much more anxious about issues like diversity, social justice, inclusion. Most of the debates about the composition of our civil service or our House of Commons in Britain, and indeed a lot of the debates about the Senate and Congress are not about whether we have enough clever people from elite universities. It's about whether we have people who are representative enough of the general population. Do we have enough people from ethnically diverse backgrounds? Do we have enough people from working class backgrounds? Do we have enough people who've come from various areas of the country? So I'm just wondering whether this is actually achievable in Britain or the United States, or whether what you're imagining is something that simply doesn't sit with our politics.
Very good question. Well, Max Weber, when he came to visit the United States in the early 20th century, went around looking at attitudes to the civil service and whether it was possible to create a centralized elite civil service in the United States on the German and to some extent the British model. And he concluded at the end of his trip that it was completely impossible because Americans wanted civil servants they could look down upon and then spit upon, rather than those that they had to look up to. And there is a problem with very democratic, egalitarian societies, and that's some of their strength, but it's also some of their weakness. But one of the reasons we wrote this book was so quickly, to come out in the middle of the pandemic, is that we think this pandemic is going to create an enormous debate about very, very fundamental things, where we go from here. And we wanted to be part of the shaping of this debate, get into the shaping of this debate as early as we could. And one of the things we wanted to argue is that populism, egalitarianism, the revolt against the elites may well have gone too far. There are many arguments for diversity and representativeness, but there's also a very strong argument for excellence. And I think that what we have argued is that we want to recreate some of the spirit of excellence. We accept the spirit of excellence in the private sector. We relish it, we worship it, but we don't in the public sector. Why is that? What is it about the public sector that is inimical to the spirit of excellence? And one of the things that we argue is we've got to try and get around that. We've got to understand that elitism can be applied to the public sector. That if you had, as the French have done so brilliantly, if you had a section of the public sector that is identified with incredible quality, that people of the highest order want to get into, then it can galvanize the public sector. There's a difference between a politician being paid £1 million and a civil servant being paid £1 million, I think. One is representative, the other is selected by some meritocratic process.
Although, of course, in Singapore, the politicians are too.
And the difference between a politician and an administrator is less stark than it is. But we also try and argue that there are ways in which our elitist approach could be married to a more representative approach. So we are very concerned about the fragmentation of society, and with the public sector and the private sector pulling further apart. And we argue for national service, not in the sort of Colonel Blimpish military sort of national service, but civic service of all people, whatever their class, working for a certain period, for a year or so, when they leave university or when they leave school, in order to bring people from different backgrounds together. Because at the moment, people from the cognitive elite only meet people from the working classes when the people from the working classes are bringing them Amazon delivery packages. We say that is a big problem. We also argue for a system of national scholarships based on Jefferson's idea of national scholarships, whereby the state spots and selects people very early on, sends them to schools, perhaps elite schools, private schools, sends them to universities, pays all of their fees, and in return for that, they do some work for the government. And I think that both connects the government with all classes in society and also provides the state with really bright people, which it doesn't tend to get, so they go into the private sector. Again, that is actually what they do in Singapore. It's a very successful idea there. So we are trying to balance a more elitist approach with a more inclusive approach, but perhaps we do need more elitism in the public sector, and perhaps the populist frenzy was a mistake.
Great. Well, I'm now opening up to the audience, and we've got a great first question coming in from Pepe Carmel, who is saying, where is the evidence? He's actually put in two questions. I didn't take the second question. And everybody else who has a question, please type the message in. But let's start with Pepe. He's asking, where is the evidence for the pursuit of excellence in the private sector? What I read in The Economist is tales of CEOs piling debt on their companies in order to line their own pockets while skimping on R&D. So Pepe's provocative claim is that your own magazine suggests that the idea of paying people stupendous sums of money doesn't actually result in excellence. It results in inefficiency and larceny.
Well, I better answer that since I do now work for The Economist and John no longer does. But I think that, yes, there are overpaid people in the private sector, and yes, there is some skimping on R&D investment. But if you look at the most successful parts of the American private sector, which are the tech companies, they are incredibly good at recruiting the best people, at human capital, and they're investing a lot of money in R&D. They're not pursuing short-term profits. Amazon being a classic example. Amazon didn't pay anything back to its investors for a long period of time. It kept plowing money back, keeps plowing money back, and is very much managed for the future. So I think that that's not true of the most dynamic companies in the United States. And I also think there's a sort of ethos about some elements in the private sector. There's an ethos about Google that says excellence, that says innovation. There's an ethos about the whole technological cluster in Silicon Valley. There's an ethos about McKinsey's that says if you're bright, if you're good, you will go there and you know you're going to be valued as an excellent person, and you know you're going to get an education, you're going to be developed. And I would argue for a McKinsey's, as it were, of the public sector, or a Google of the public sector, so that the really brightest and best people will say, I'd like to be doing that. I'd like to be going to the, as they do in France. France has done exceptionally well in this way.
So if I could yet again encourage people to start typing questions into the chat box, which you'll see on the bottom of your screen. If you just go down to the black bar on the bottom of the screen and click on chat, you'll be able to put in a question of any sort. But let me turn to John. Is it possible, do you think, in contemporary politics to really get to where you and Adrian are going? I mean, France is actually in a very strange situation in which Macron is under enormous pressure to close down the elite institutions, to close down these grands écoles, which produce their elite civil servants, because people hate the idea of elitism so much. And much of the conversation in the West is not really about wanting more elitism. It's about wanting redistribution. It's about wanting equality. It's about social justice and diversity. So where do we go, John?
Well, two things. I come back on two things. One is, I think, on the pure question of elitism. Yeah, that I think it's quite interesting. Just to add one thing to what Adrian said, is if you go back to the 1960s, which is when we would argue was the last time that sort of pay in the private sector and the public sector were vaguely compatible. That was the last time that Americans really trusted their government, and there was more of a unity back then. I think the same would apply to Britain. I think in terms of, I would have stressed that the elite, the argument about the elite, we did write an article for the Wall Street Journal about it, but that's a part of this book, but not everything. It's a part of the argument about government, goes all the way back to Plato, who advocated a group of guardians who would run government, and they were largely male guardians, and they would be rewarded.
No. Females.
No, females too. I'm with Adrian on this. Females and males. They just had very strict rules on how much sex they could have with each other.
They were allowed orgies, I think, at different times, which might help in modern day Washington. But anyway, I've drifted off the point. The main point I was going to make is actually a big chunk of this book tries to deal with issues of equality and so on. Is that at one particular time, we ask ourselves the question, how would you make government better? And what we do, the device we use to do that, is we pull from history. We pull the two great leaders of the 19th century, from the Anglo-American perspective anyway. We pull Abraham Lincoln from America, and we bring William Gladstone from Britain, 4 times Liberal Prime Minister, and for whom kind of social equality, or certainly raising the poor, was the great crusade, as indeed it was a lot of the time for Abraham Lincoln. And we put these two people together into a Frankenstein model called Bill Lincoln, a mix between William Gladstone and Abraham Lincoln. And we ask, if you elected this person into the White House, we point out they could be equally a Republican or a Democrat. On the one hand, they fervently believe in small government. On the other hand, they have an undiluted ambition to help the poor. And we ask, what could they do? And we only set ourselves one parameter, which would apply equally to the private sector if you were looking at how to run a company. In the public sector, we just say they can only use things that other countries are already using. And I think if you look at what has gone wrong, when I talked about COVID particularly, and you mentioned equality, one of the great problems of America is the lack of a public health system. And we think one of the first things that President Bill Lincoln would do would be to set up a universal health system. And we would do that for 2 reasons. One, because we think it is the decent thing to do. The second is because we are pretty convinced that it'd be far cheaper. The idea that a public health system is sort of socialism is just rubbish created by the drugs companies and the insurers. To give you one example, Sweden spends less money per head on public healthcare. We're not talking at all about private healthcare, which in America is a fortune. Spends less money on public healthcare than America. And the reason why is America has all these wretched nightmares of co-payments and whether you qualify for this or you qualify for that. And we argue that if you were President Bill Lincoln, one of the first things you would do is you would take the American and you would borrow probably from either Canada or Germany, or maybe even again actually bits of Singapore, and you would design a system. You would take a system that would actually supply things to everybody, and it would probably end up being cheaper. That's one side. And the second thing is the tax code. At the moment, the tax code in America, and many of the people on this call, I hate to tell you, would sadly be beneficiaries of this. There is $1.6 trillion worth of exemptions in the tax code. Any reforming Prime Minister, and William Gladstone was known as the People's William, as you well know, for his desire to help the poor, but you would strip out those exemptions and start pushing them back. And virtually all the exemptions go to the better off. America spends more money on mortgage interest tax relief than it does on social housing for the poor. And that is where the system has gone wrong. And so I think that part of the issue of equality is wrapped up in the issue of bad government. And I think that these things do make a difference around the world. If you look right the way around the world, people are looking at America at the moment. And I think they have two questions. One is, why on earth is America not leading a coalition of democracies when it comes to kind of trading with China, when it comes to dealing with autocracies? And why is America in this particular test done so much worse than China? But the second thing is, why should we follow a country that cannot look after its poor? We all saw on our TV screens, we saw doctors in New York having to wear ski goggles because there wasn't enough equipment in the richest city in the world. People are flabbergasted by that. And in the book, we make a very, hopefully powerful argument that democracies generally did better than autocracies in this disease. But the horrible fact of this is, if you look at China and you look at America, this was a disease that we all thought would be China's Chernobyl when it first emerged. And, the Chinese regime certainly made mistakes on it. But by any measure, you have been safer being a Chinese citizen than you have being an American citizen. And that is something none of us would have thought possible, maybe even 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. And so I think there are real quick issues for America behind this. And then they're uncomfortable, unpleasant ones, but it's our job to raise them because we believe fundamentally in America.
So Michael Siegel, following on that, says he agrees about the performance of most Western countries and politicians. However, it seems to him that much of the credit for China's success should be attributed to their dictatorial government that has little or no regard for any civil liberties or individual rights. Who'd like to take that?
Yeah, I'll take that. I think that's one of the major arguments that's come in response to COVID is that this proves that when you have an emergency, autocracies are better at dealing with emergencies than democracies, because democracies are messy, they're gridlocked, they're slow to respond in all sorts of ways, and that's just part of being free. And we reject that for many reasons. One is that there are many autocracies that actually haven't dealt with this COVID crisis very well. Russia, Russia being one example, Azerbaijan, Belarus, a whole bunch of them. So there is nothing inherent in autocracy in the ability to just tell people what to do that makes you better. At the same time, there are many democracies that have dealt very well with this thing. Singapore's not a democracy, but it's certainly not an autocracy. South Korea is a democracy. Taiwan. Those are countries that have dealt dramatically well with this. New Zealand has dealt dramatically well with this. So the differentia specifica, as it were, is not central autocracy. It's the quality of government. Indeed, China's autocracy got it off to a very slow start because people were so terrified to report anything that was going on in Wuhan to the central government that they tried to bury it. So it's a matter of the quality of government. And I think the quality of government depends on simple efficiencies, on just how well it's run. And South Korea, for example, Seoul, has been is very well run. It had a very, very innovative mayor who prided himself on being quite close to the people. It's also, if you look at the world's smart cities, cities that integrate technology, the Internet of Things with the general running of their cities, almost all of them are now in the Far East, and they take all sorts of measures which we couldn't possibly do. For example, if you go into the subway system, in Shanghai, when you enter individual carriages, you have to show your smartphone to the bar reader, and the bar reader will register that you've gone there. So that's gone down to the level of individual carriages, so they can trace who's been where, or in order to contact them if they get COVID. Something that would be impossible on the London Underground, certainly on the New York subway system. So I think the advantages not lie with autocracy. The other thing I think is trust. That governments that have a reasonably high degree of trust, the people who have a reasonably high degree of trust in their governments have done well. Germany is a high trust society. New Zealand is a high trust society. Britain and the United States are low trust societies, particularly the United States. And if you're suspicious of government, you don't obey it, you don't listen to it, and you indulge in all sorts of weird conspiracy theories. So I think authoritarianism is not the thing that really matters. I think competence in government is much more important.
Right. So here we have Ben Rosen coming in. And Ben says, John, you're right about most things, but on November the 3rd, when the Democrats win Congress and the presidency, you'll witness a renaissance of America. The biggest thrill to us is the excitement and determination of today's youth to change the world, and by the way, the US. The young people running for and winning elections starting in 2018 after 2 years of Trump's and more so after 4 are growing rapidly. The new golden age is coming soon. We have awakened. There we are, John.
Thank you, Ben. I will now always think as a young person drifting towards power. No, but I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting. There is a slight. I mean, normally on most calls we get the kind of exactly opposite, the cynical side of the anti-Rosen point of view, which is along these lines: is that nothing in America will ever change. And Rory, you put a bit across. I think there is at the youthful end, maybe there is just a tiny bit of a renaissance of the same degree of public service, of people being interested in doing these things. A lot of their ideas might strike me on some levels of being misguided, but there is at least some degree of enthusiasm again. But boy, it's got a long way to go. I mean, you're sitting in Yale. I would bet fairly heavily that most of the people there are looking for jobs in those horrible companies like Google and Compaq, even, or the sons of Compaq. People are still looking towards those sort of organizations at the moment in America. There is not enough factor on the public sector. And I wish that if Ben is right and the Democrats sweep all these things, that will give them an opportunity. But you look at the Democratic platform and there is nothing. There's one page out of 250 has something about reforming government in it. And the reason is really that all those people who Ben possibly correctly applauds, they have very little, they haven't thought through how to do this. And secondly, many of them have got acutely close ties to the public sector unions, which is part of the huge problem to do with the efficiency of this. And again, what's interesting to us is you look at this problem. If we had locked some of the participants of this call, certainly Rory and us, in a room and said which governments would be able to deal with COVID and which would make a complete Horlicks of it, we would have got some governments wrong. I don't think many of us would have guessed that Greece would be very good at it, which they ended up being. But the reason why is they have a clever prime minister who's come in, who forced people to do testing, and also realised the basic problem really quickly, that Greece's healthcare system was shot, and that the only way to do this was to go into lockdown early to prevent the health system being pushed. So we would have got some things wrong. I think you could well argue that Singapore, compared with how good Singapore is at most things, did slightly worse even. I mean, obviously 10, 20 times better than America, but that's comparing against the pits. The really basic thing is just, you cannot, if you're American, you cannot run away from the statistics, and the statistics are so simple. Look at them on schools, look at them on, schools. America spends more than most, gets worse results. Health, it spends more than most publicly, and it gets worse results. And then you really expect it to do better on COVID. I mean, there are still some elite parts of the American public sector, I think parts of the armed forces, there's bits which are really quite clever, but that overall there is not the same dedication to making it work better that there is in the private sector. And that is an imbalance. You know, if you look back through history, and again, there are people on this call who studied history, including Rory and others. If you look back through history, you know, plagues are those moments which often great empires suffer from. Athens surrendered to Sparta shortly after a plague. Rome went through 2 massive plagues which destabilized it. On the other hand, 100 years ago, we had the Spanish flu, and quite a lot of democracies reacted quite well to that. Many of the ideas, and people on this call may not entirely associate them, you know, many of the welfare state that many people here have gained from all their lives began in part in the slums of London, because people there were worried about pestilence and tried to deal with it. So it's from our perspective, yes, you know, I do hope that if Democrats win, that there is a new spirit of pervading government. But don't underestimate the challenge. Just simply putting good people in there, you have to change the system. To throw the question back at Penn, it's like a company which has got a crap leader, but it doesn't really matter if the company is making the wrong thing in the wrong way. You have to change that as well.
Okay, so we've got 2 related questions, which I'm going to bring in now. Martha Fleischman says, the tech companies exemplify the continuation of elite hiring and have poor record for diversity in race, gender, etc. What's different? So that's one challenge on excellence. And related to that, Todd Piker comes in and says, given your comments on excellence, can you speak to whether the CDC in the US pre-Trump could be cited as a government-run organization that had achieved a degree of excellence? If so, why? If not, why not?
Adrian, Georgia.
Yeah, two very hard questions there. I would say of the diversity in Silicon Valley, it's definitely a problem for them, but they're in an area of computer science engineering that has been for a very, very, very long time dominated by men, associated with men. It's got a sort of macho culture almost to it. So it's hard to adjust in that way. But I think that these companies now have basically reached the limit of their traditional hiring pools, and just the logic of competition will force them to hire people of a more diverse sort. Both geographically, they're going to have to go further outside their comfort zone. They're going to have to go from Yale and other traditional elite recruiting grounds to state universities, and to ethnic minorities, and to women, simply by the force of competition and the logic of size. So I think that they'll remain elitist, but in a more inclusive way. And I think it's quite possible to be both elitist and exclusive. On the CDCs, I think the CDC is a model of excellence. And I think the problem with the CDC and its role in this crisis has been, I'm afraid, that the president and the way the president has trashed experts, has undermined its confidence, has adopted different policies, has not implemented its policies quickly enough. So I think America had the expertise. It didn't have the government that was capable of acting swiftly. And the most important thing about this virus was to act as quickly as possible, as quickly as possible. The economic consequences, the health consequences are massively diminished if you act quickly. And acting quickly means listening to the CDC, listening to experts, and getting a simple, consistent message out there. And in all of those things, it was the White House that messed up, not any of America's elite medical institutions. Although I do accept exactly what John said, that the healthcare system overall is a big problem.
So Kenneth Cooper says, I think you underestimate the consequences of a president who spent the last 3 years dividing Americans against each other, especially in a country so geographically and culturally diverse.
Well, two things. One, America was not exactly undivided when it came in. And secondly, yes, okay, we are, this book is not a paean of praise to Donald Trump, as Adrian just pointed out. We point out all the mistakes he's made. But you could have had anybody in charge of America. And if you have the healthcare system you have, you would have ended up with the problems you do. If anyone here really thinks that George Floyd was shot by Donald Trump, it's not part of the system. It's there are deep problems in American government which America has to confront. And I don't think this problem to do with the kind of quality of people generally who are going to come Donald Trump has done nothing to help that. He has rubbish civil servants, he's attacked them, he's caused problems. The bit where I would, and we have not talked about this enough, the bit where I would absolutely agree with the questioner is this idea of division. And actually the bit where I think Donald Trump's divisions within America have been very painful. I think it's very difficult to think of a big public disaster where the kind of president has so conspicuously gone to war with governors, with individual Democrats, with states, and talked about cutting off funding. Traditionally, this is a time when countries come together. That's what happened most of the other places. The bit which I think, and there are people on this call who spent their lifetime in diplomacy, the real, one of the long-term tragedies of this plague and of Trump's particular presidency, which I do worry about enormously, is the West in the broader sense. You look at the democracies of the world, and they are immensely stronger than the autocracies. You put Europe and America together, and by any measure, they represent a much more powerful economic, military, whatever power. You start adding in the democracies of Asia, you add in because most of the countries we've talked about, Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, Japan, these are all countries which we yearn for American leadership. And one of the great tragedies, I think, when historians come back to look at this period, is here was something that was not necessarily that political. We can blame whether China had some role in it to begin with. This was a supreme opportunity for a president to unite the West, not just in the sense of America and Europe, but the West more broadly in the sense of the democracies of Asia, and say, at the very least, even if China didn't want to join in, we will work together on vaccines, we will work together on testing, America will lead. And all of that has failed. And I think the long-term consequences of that could be enormous, because look at Singapore in a different context. You sit there, Singapore has taken a somewhat passive attitude towards Huawei, towards things that America regards, rightly or wrongly, as enormously important. And yet it's been unable to persuade it. And I think, for me, the tragedy of Donald Trump, again, when historians come to look at him, they might argue that he did get one big thing right. He decided to confront China. That was, people might say that he saw that this was a chance for America to kind of take on China in some way. But they will have completely, the tragedy of Donald Trump is that he never learned from the previous Cold War, despite having announced that we're in a new one. And the previous Cold War was won by alliance. Again, there are people on this call. It was won by alliances. It was won by bringing allies in. The fact that Britain is still dithering about exactly what to do with Huawei, let alone most of Europe, countries that America protects, are not lining up behind it. That is a terrible indictment of America's soft power at the moment. And it's partly to do with just treating allies well. And it's partly also to do with the song you sing. You go back during the Cold War, and America never stopped talking about freedom. In some cases, it was deemed to be hypocritical. In other cases, it was being disingenuous. But it never stopped speaking about that. If you just simply say America first, that is not a message that resonates anywhere. And that is the bit, the sort of failure of the West, which also this book is trying to point out. And I think that is something immensely important, regardless of your political allegiance in America.
So following on from this, we've now got a couple of interventions which are more on the pessimistic side, pushing back a little bit against some of the optimism. So Bonnie Burnham says, you're taking for granted a groundswell against Trump, but this is not in any way a given. He might win and probably will. And Diana Djokovic says, while we wait for the new golden age in which I believe American society is facing multiple challenges politically and socially, many of them particularly polarizing. Energy is waning and the pandemic, by all accounts, waxing. How do we help officials take significant steps on COVID in light of these stark contextual challenges?
Yes, I mean, I think that the idea that we're about to enter a new global age, a new golden age, as soon as Trump disappears, is if he does disappear, is not quite right. And there will be a lot of optimism, but I worry that that optimism will curdle quite quickly. I also worry that we'll have a period of liberal overreach, which will ignore the fact that Trump was a symptom of something very deep, which was a massive amount of discontent in working class, blue collar, flyover America. And if they see a lot of dancing on Trump's grave, and if the new democratic elite that takes over doesn't address itself to the problems of the white working class, then I think that you're storing up another Trump, huge problems in the future. So let's be tough on Trump, but let's be tough on the causes of Trumpism. I hope that Biden, being a sort of blue collar style Democrat, might well, and being older, I think, might well be able to avoid that triumphalism and might well be able to see that we need to address those problems. Also, more structurally, I would say there are, as we've repeatedly emphasized, there are big structural problems in the United States that need some really serious solutions, and that we can't yet see in the Democratic platform. If you look at the issue of the police, defunding the police is not the solution, but there are very clear problems with the management of the police, with the fact that it's almost impossible to sack incompetent, brutal police people with the extraordinary power of police unions. And that's something that's a problem for the Democrats as well as the Republicans. I think that if you look at the very mediocre performance of America's schools on average, given the amount of money that's spent on them, that is a problem with the fact that is connected with the fact that you cannot sack incompetent teachers. You cannot promote rapidly very promising young teachers. You have, again, entrenched union powers. So if the Democrats are willing to take on their own vested interests, that's great. But if they're not, then we've got another set of problems coming from the left to match the terrible problems that we've had coming from the right.
Well, we're just coming now to the very end. I'm sure John and Adrian, for whom it's now 1 a.m, have in different ways very interesting, important jobs which require them to keep their brains sharp, may eventually need to move on. But I wanted to bring in John very briefly, just for some final remarks, to see if there's anything more that you wanted to say. And then I'm just going to wrap up briefly and recommend this book very strongly to people. But John, over to you just for a couple of minutes, and then we'll wrap it up.
Well, several things. One is to thank people again for coming and listening. We do, and particularly thank Donna and Ben for helping organise it, notwithstanding Ben's question. The more we wrote this book, we would give a little bit of history. We wrote this book because we wrote an article for Bloomberg, which we imagined that if you wrote an article about Thomas Holtz and John Stuart Mill and these big thinkers about government in the middle of a pandemic, people wouldn't pay. What struck us as rather surprising was suddenly huge amounts of people began to write to us from around the world. And what was unusual about that is that they were partly the kind of Rory Stewarts of the world. They were people who'd been in government, who understood it and things like that. But there was also a huge demand, actually, strangely, from people who'd never really heard of Thomas Holtz, didn't know why they did it, or why the issue about what government was for. And the aim of this book is partly, yes, it's to tell the West it has to wake up. Because in the end, you can, there are great statesmen on this call. You can be a great statesman. You can go out. You can run American foreign policy wonderfully. A great businessman on this call. You can be a fantastic American businessman. You can do all these things. But at the end, if your government does not work, the lesson of history is incredibly clear. In the end, you will fail. And you've had a living example in this disease of how having a really bad government, and I mean a bad government structure, does not work. So that was one part of it. The second thing was that we do not claim, even late at night and drinking wine, to be great thinkers. But we would desperately like to encourage great thought, because you go back to the universities at the moment, you mentioned these issues of equality and diversity and so on. They are incredibly important. They dominate a large part of my day. But what is striking is if you look at the great thinkers of the work, of the state over the course of history, you look at Hobbes, you look at Mill, you look at these people who, we mentioned Plato even, the horrible thing is that when you try to work out how to think about the future of government and the future of the state and what the role of the state is in life, there is not much going on in those American universities you talked about. There's quite a lot arguing from the basis that you already have in some way a functioning democracy, and then so therefore it's fine to argue about questions of identity and so on. But there is not at the moment a lot of thought about what exactly the state is for, what it's there. And part of the aim of this book, short, as many people have pointed out, including my boss, being one of its charms, is that part of the aim of this short book is to say to people, we've got to start thinking about this again, because the history of the West is really simple. When the West has thought about government, it has gone ahead of other societies. Years ago, China was as far ahead of us as we were of China in the 1960s, possibly much further. But we got ahead because we thought about these issues. So I think that the argument to people beyond please buy the book is buy the book in order to start sort of thinking about this thing that matters enormously. And at the moment, too many people are avoiding. There are some heroic exceptions, such as yourself, Rory, but there are not many people, sadly, who begin to think about the public sector and government generally in a systemic way, let alone in the kind of way that people like John Stuart Mill and Thomas Hobbes did. So that would be our thing. So thank you, but also an appeal to people to take this subject much more seriously than they've done so, or not just simply to trust on removing Trump. That is indeed your aim. Anyway, thank you.
Well, thank you, both of you, very, very much indeed. I apologize for the creaking, which is presumably my 5-year-old naughtily trying to creak out of bed into this conversation, but I will brief him on the conversation tomorrow morning. This has been a wonderful conversation. It's an incredibly exciting civilized conversation. We've touched on everything from classical philosophers and Enlightenment thinkers to details about the music scene in Seoul and the way the Seoul subway system works. We've tied it into deep questions about the future of the United States. And at the heart of this whole discussion, which John and Adrian bring alive to us, is the question of politics, of government and the state, which, of course, for these classical philosophers was literally the most important thing that anybody could think about. For Aristotle, politics is the mastercraft. It seems to him obvious that the way in which we organize our societies, the way in which our communities are structured, the way in which we bring justice to people, has to be the most important thing that any thinker should ever engage with. And it's wonderful to see such bright, engaged, and also worldly people taking seriously these issues in the light of a very practical thing, which is COVID, and at a time of this great election. So thank you so much. Thank you very much to our wonderful hosts in this extraordinary bookshop. Thank you to Ben and Donna Rosen, who also were responsible for bringing me on board. But a particular thank you to John and Adrian coming to us from 1 a.m. in London. And I encourage everybody to buy this book and to wake up. Everybody to wake up, that is, except for Adrian, John, and my 5-year-olds.
We're going to go to sleep. Thank you. Very good.
Thank you. And on behalf of House of Books here in Kent, Connecticut, thank you so much, Rory. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, John. Books are available if you need a copy. houseofbooksct.com/wakeupcall. houseofbooksct.com/wakeupcall. Thank you so very much for coming, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you. Good night, all.
Thanks, Rory.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, well done. Bye-bye.